Hello, everyone, and welcome to this webinar. Thank you for joining. My name is Diana, and I'm Product Manager at Applied. And today I would love to talk about finding ways to reduce the impact of assessing candidates and using CVs to screen them for a hiring process. And the way we're going to do this is, as many of you may be aware, on Applied, we're on a mission to become the essential platform for unbiased hiring. And our hiring software improves diversity and predicts the best candidates. And the way we do this is by nudging organizations to move into a journey of skills-based hiring, where you can use the most predictive and fairest methods to identify and make decisions about candidates. And CV screening, using CVs to identify and understand candidates' talent, is not on the top list of the most predictive and fairest methods. But we understand that many organizations may have different circumstances that make it hard to step away from CVs. So what you can do is to start taking some first steps towards this journey of skill-based hiring. And that's the focus of today's webinar, to talk about what to do if you're still using CVs to screen candidates. So what we're going to do to focus on this main goal is to go through these 3 learning objectives. The first one is to share with you evidence about CVs, resumes. There's lots of evidence about the impact that it has in terms of bias, in terms of predictive power, and in terms of fairness. So I want to share that with you. The second step is to talk about the benefits of skills-based hiring. So starting from that point of CV screening, I will walk you to an ideal state of screening candidates where you can see the benefits of incorporating different behavioral design principles to find the best candidates for the job. And finally, the third point of this agenda is to mix point 1 and 2 and say, okay, we're still using CVs. What's the best we can do to assess candidates as objectively as possible and to mitigate for bias? So let's get started. The first thing that I would like to talk about is when we talk about fairer way to use CVs, this is what we're talking about. It's about focusing on skills, using focused questions or building rubrics to be as objective as possible and transparent with your decision-making about a CV. And finally, using the wisdom of the crowd. That means acknowledging that as human beings, we can make subjective decisions, and those subjective decisions can be averaged out when many of us can make independent decisions about a CV, and that's the final score that's taken into account to make a final decision about who to hire. So let's start with the truth about CVs. Let's start with this example, and this is an example of many pieces of research that have been done throughout the years about the impact of using CVs. So this is what we call an experiment. And in this experiment, a group of German researchers wanted to understand the impact of job opportunities between being a female migrant versus being a German citizen. And what they did is that they created a bunch of CVs with the same information about experience, education, and other information you add on CVs. And a group of CVs, the only difference was how the candidate was named and the picture it had. In this case, what we had, one group of CVs was named by Sandra Bauer. And in this case, the callback rate, people who called Sandra to an interview, it was 90% of the CVs that were sent were called back to have an interview. There was a second group of CVs that had exactly the same information. The main difference was, in this case, the name. It was the same picture. So it was same CV, same information, same picture. But in this case, we're talking about Miriam Osterk. In this case, the callback rate was 14%. And then we had a third group of CVs with exactly the same information on the CV, except for now being named Miriam Osterk and Miriam having a headscarf. And now you can see how the callback rate changes dramatically from 14% and 4% to 4%. And sadly, this is not the only type of research that has been done. Between 2009 and 2016, there has been at least 90 studies on correspondence studies, this is how we call, call them, across 26 countries that show that maintaining the same information in CVs but changing the name has a huge impact on who do you move through a hiring process and who's successful for the hiring process. You can see it for the German context that we just talked about, but there's also examples from France and the United Kingdom. And what I want to highlight here is that these experiments have been mainly focused on changing names. But what we can also see from the following slide is that even if you anonymize CVs, there are lots of pieces of information on a CV that can influence how you decide on that CV and whether the candidate's good or not for the job. Just to give you some examples, this is a source of bias, the halo effect, that can influence how you think about a candidate. So we see, for example, this case, it's a project manager who worked at Google. Given that we have some preconceptions about how good or bad Google is, we can think that then, therefore, this candidate is good for the job, independently of how they performed. We can also identify with affinity bias. So if someone took the same course or went to the same university as I did, or came from the same country where I come from, I would very likely rate them better on their CV. Or even we have groupthink. Maybe I got this CV because my boss handed this CV to me, and I am now unconsciously pressured to rate the CV in a particular way. So you see, all this type of information, not only names, can influence how we score or rate a candidate on a CV. To add a bit more of elements on how CVs can lead to bias or to different outcomes than the ones we desire, let's look at this type of effect. We call it the Nobel Prize winner. So as you look at CVs, you usually look at them in a particular order. And the decisions you make in a given CV are not isolated from what you looked before or after. So in this case, what you see here, what we call the Nobel Prize winner effect, is that the judgment that you make on a candidate is dependent on the previous judgments you made on other candidates. In this case, this research, what it did is that first they asked reviewers to assess a candidate without any previous candidates being assessed. And in this case, the average score was 3.14. And then for another group of reviewers, they gave them, before they reviewed this average candidate, they gave them not so good performance candidates, so bottom performing candidates. In this case, the average score of this candidate increased to 3.26. And finally, the same candidate was reviewed after the top performer, the Nobel Prize winner in this case. And for that same candidate, the score was less for the one who was reviewed after the top performer. So you see, decisions are relative, and how you assess CVs in which order can also have an impact on who you call back to an interview, for example. So all this comes with CVs, and that's why we believe that there are alternative methods that you could use, if you can, to mitigate for bias in your hiring process. And what we've talked so far is about mainly bias, right, and fairness. Those are the main metrics that you observe when you are looking at the types of experiments that I just talked about. But the impact of screening CVs goes beyond that. The impact of screening CVs has an impact basically on performance, on actually understanding whether a candidate is going to be good for the job. And this is another piece of evidence that shows this. So lots of years of research of collecting evidence show that the variables that you usually collect or use or observe with CVs, like reference checks, years of experience, and years of education, are on the bottom list of the methods that can be predictive of performance on the job. This contrasts with work sample tests, where you assess candidates on real scenario challenges that they will face on the job, or compared to structured interviews, where the aim is to assess all candidates on the same questions in a structured way. And also contrast with cognitive ability tests. So this is another piece of evidence that we want to highlight about the truth of using CVs. If we contrast this CV screening approach and all the caveats and all the impact that it has with this benefits of skills-based hiring, you'll see why we promote this alternative approach. So when we talk about skills-based hiring, we're talking about using an alternative screening process. And this alternative screening process has a first step, which is don't think about CVs. Instead of thinking about CVs, focus on asking work sample questions. For example, if you are hiring for a project manager, ask questions related to the job of being a project manager. And so in this case, Mrs. Blue, Mr. Gold, and Miss Aqua are asked those questions instead of CVs. After you ask those questions, anonymize if you can, so you can remove the bias that comes from identifying someone with their name. After you do that, we talk about chunking the answers in the questions. And the aim of this is to reduce the cognitive load that comes from reviewing a complex piece of information. It's harder for us as human beings to judge question 1, 2, and 3 in the same go than to assess all answers to question 1, then all answers to question 2, and then all answers to question 3, because you're focusing in this way on the same criteria, and it's easy to compare answers in what matters for the job. After you chunk the questions, you can then randomize them and review them. So as we talked before, there's an impact coming from the order of the answers. It could be driven by things like if you had lunch or not before you reviewed a question. That can impact your decision making. So randomizing mitigates for different factors that may lead to bias. And besides randomizing the answers, so people can be assessed in different order, you'd incorporate what we already talked about, the wisdom of the crowd. So subjectivity is in everything we make, in many things that we decide on every day. And a way to address this subjectivity or tackle it is to have independent views about a subject, and what you use is the average of these independent views. So when you review, in this case for question 1, you're taking into account the perspectives of 3 hiring team members that are subjective independently, but when you average them out, you're already controlling for that subjectivity. And what you have at the end after this screening process is a ranking of candidates based on their final score. So in this case, Mrs. Blue is the top performer for this screening process. So that's the ideal screening process that we would recommend. But we understand again that moving from CVs to no CVs at all and moving to this process can be a big jump, and it requires lots of change for many organizations, and it's hard to step away from CV screening. So what we recommend is to take a first step to fairer hiring. And the step that we recommend you to take is still use CVs, but try to embed principles from behavioral science that help you to be more objective when looking at a CV and comparing candidates on their CVs. Why do we think that this is a first step? We'll see more elements here, but it's going to help you focus on skills as the first starting point. So when we talk about skills, we're talking about different elements, but what matters is the combination of 3 key ingredients. The first key ingredient, of course, is what we call skills, attitudes, and behaviors. So we're talking about skills as a broad term that can cover all of these key elements for determining talent. So we'll give an example of in a bit. After you have those skills, attitudes, and behaviors, we recommend you to think about the tasks and responsibilities that are relevant for the job and how the skills should be reflected on those tasks and responsibilities. And once you have these 2 ingredients, the third ingredient is to try to bring the real challenges for the job when performing those tasks and showcasing those skills, because that's how real job is, right? It's you perform a task, but then you have some trade-offs that you need to take into account. So those are the 3 key ingredients for skills-based hiring. Let's look at an example to make this more tangible. So let's say you're hiring for a project manager and you want to find the best candidate for this position. In this case, you can have these 3 ingredients divided like this. On the first side of skills, attitudes, and behaviors, you will be looking for skills like budgeting, delegating, monitoring, stakeholder management. You want to see how candidates can excel with those skills, performing tasks and responsibilities. In this case, it is building and maintaining relationships with stakeholders, assigning tasks, ensuring timely delivery. So those are tasks, showing progress, conversations with different team members, etc. And then finally, depending on the type of role, there may be different types of challenges. So for example, you are focusing on timely delivery and you notice that a colleague is not delivering one key input that is relevant for that end goal. So how would you manage that situation? So what we're highlighting here is having that mindset of balancing all these three ingredients so you can focus on assessing what matters for the job. And when you're looking at CVs, how can candidates showcase these three elements so you can make decisions that matter for hiring the best person for the job. Once you have this key element of skills-focused hiring, the next step is to look at your CVs from a more objective standpoint and using objective scoring. And in this case, what we're talking about is using ways to have a standard way to judge whether a CV on different attributes is good or bad, or it's in between or good or bad, right? So you can define the role, highlighting what are the key requirements in this case that they showcase with the example, budgeting skills, stakeholder management, for example. That's what matters for you. Then you can identify on a Likert scale what good or bad looks like. 1 means X for the team, 5 means that they can show that they are good at stakeholder management. And then when you do that, you can make explicit if there are different reviewers, or even if you are the only reviewer of person who is screening a CV, you can be true to that rubric, saying, if I see a CV in 1 month's time, I remember that the rubric that I set up was score with 1 if this is shown in the CV, or score with 5 if this is shown. So you have explicitly some heuristics or rules of thumb that guide you on when to score a CV with a 1 or a 5, for example. And this is to be a bit more detailed, how you could start introducing this objective scoring into your CV screening. So you can ask these types of questions about their responsibilities and how they showcase the minimum skill set for the role. If the CV helps you understand how they contribute to organizational or team goals and outcomes, or if the CV and what the candidate describes in the CV shows accomplishments that indicates that they're going to perform well for the job. So you move away from this abstract yes or no thinking to a explicit, more transparent and objective way of thinking about CVs that can be traceable and that can help you make better decisions for now and for the future. And then the final principle that we're talking about is the wisdom of the crowd. I already mentioned it before, and what I'll do before going more into detail is to give you a new example. And this is given by some research done on interviews. So what you see on this chart is one first column that shows the level of accuracy of having a single interviewer on an interview. And accuracy in this case is defined by how good is the interviewer's opinions or scores into predicting if someone's going to be hired. So in this case, having a single interviewer gave an average of 55% accuracy. The researchers then incorporated 3 interviewers. And in this case, what you see, it's a big contrast. By having 3 or more interviewers, the level of accuracy increases in 1.6 times. So that's why we believe in the wisdom of the crowd. And no matter the piece of information, in this case of CV that you're assessing, the more perspectives, independent perspectives, because you want to avoid groupthink, the better. In this case, you'll see the incremental value of incorporating one extra perspective in your review process. So to finalize, I will share with you how Applied has embedded these principles. And again, we created this CV companion tool as part of the reflection of it can be difficult for some organizations to immediately step away from a CV screening method. But there are ways to start with the first step towards this journey of skill-based hiring that will give you better outcomes in terms of diversity, employee performance, retention. So what we did in this case with the CV companion is to incorporate some of the principles we mentioned. So you can start with this first step. And why is this a first good step? The first one is that, as we mentioned before, you can start with this approach of skills-based hiring, starting with identifying what you require for the job, what's important, what are the tasks, the challenges, is the first good step, no matter the screening method. So you can start with that here too. The other reason why it's the first good step is because you still are working with something you're familiarized. You're familiarized with CV screening, and we know that changing habits individually is hard, and in an organization it's even harder. So you're incorporating new principles into a familiar method. And finally, what is good is that among the different principles that you can incorporate, you have the possibility to look at a CV and score candidates objectively using scoring rubrics, the wisdom of the crowd, and more behavioral design principles that we'll explain in a bit. So that's why we believe it's a first good step. And the way it works is tech helps you to embed those design and behavioral design principles easily. And that's why we did what we did with the applied CV companion tool. So what you do is, after candidates submit their CV and their application, hiring teams can then receive the CV so it can be scored on a set of focus questions. And these focus questions are designed to promote objectivity. So you can allocate those CVs to review, and then each hiring team member, one or many, we recommend more than one, can score the CV across all candidates for all the questions. This image shows you an example of how it works. So for this CV, we have 3 focus questions, and you can rate each question on a yes, some, or no basis. And when you have that, the system basically transforms those judgments or those decisions into a score, a 1 to 5 score that can then help you easily compare candidates and make decisions of who to shortlist. What this does, again, is to make the decision process a bit slower, in the sense that you are objectively putting a judgment and tracing it, and also more transparent. So you can all then discuss, if it's a team decision, what were the pros and cons for a candidate, so you can then shortlist them. It's also a good way to start and track potential sources of biases. So if you start with the CV scoring tool, we can, for example, at Applied, provide you stats about diversity, candidate performance, that you can then try to get more insights and then contrast with other hiring methods. So depending on the CV, on the scoring tool, you can say, hey, this hiring method may lead to more bias than this one. And this can be a great starting point to have conversations around transitioning into different hiring methods that are more focused on skills-based hiring. And as a reminder, this is, I believe, the final slide I will share with you. The key elements to success when using CVs, if you must continue using them, are these. The first one is focus on skills, focus on what really matters for the job, and try to assess that on the CVs. So try to pay less attention to the places where a candidate worked or the years of experience, because as we saw, they're not good predictors of performance and may lead to bias. Create a rubric, create explicit criteria that will help you assess what matters exactly for the job from the CV. So create focus questions, create rubrics from 1 to 5, or depending on how you use, what methods you use in your organization, that guide you to objectively assess all candidates on the same criteria. Number 3, additional ways to mitigate for bias, as you saw on our example of the ideal screening method. Try to chunk pieces of the CV if you can, if you have the technology for that. Randomize the allocation of CVs, so not all the candidates are assessed in the same order, and anonymize whenever possible. We also noticed that anonymizing names is not the only driver of mitigating, can still drive for lead to bias, but if you anonymize, you're starting a journey to less bias still. And finally, using the wisdom of the crowd, trying to involve the team in multiple perspectives, independent perspectives, to assess candidates on their CVs. That will mitigate for subjectivity and will give you a better outcome in terms of what you're looking for, which is the best candidate for the job. And that's it for this webinar. I hope you found it helpful. We're really happy to give you more resources, guidelines, and tooltips and tips on this CV screening tool. You can click on the link that you'll see here to get access to these resources. If you go to our website, there are free resources that you can also access that are related to other hiring methods, to overall ethical and predictive hiring that we'll be happy to share with you. You will see also more information about from our newsletter if you want to sign up, or from social media. You can also follow us here. Thank you so much and have a great day.